السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لأن الهدف هو العمل الحثيث من أجل وقف الحروب وإنهاء العنصرية، كانت منظمة أنسر التي أضحت أكبر تحالف ضد الحرب في العالم مع مؤسس منظمة أنسر براين بيكر ومقاربته للحروب في المنطقة من الداخل. معكم زينب الصفار، تابعونا. اعملوا الآن لمنع الحرب وإنهاء العنصرية أو تحالف أنسر هو لاعب أساسي في التظاهرات المنددة بالحرب والمناهضة لها، حتى باتت مواقفه صادمة ومثيرة للجدل وجريئة بعناوينها عبر الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. تحالف أبصر النور في 14 من أيلول سبتمبر عام 2001 ويضم المئات من المنظمات والشخصيات المرموقة ومراكز التنظيم في المدن والبلدات الأمريكية. اللجنة التوجيهية الوطنية لتحالف أنسر تمثل منظمات كبرى شنت حملات واسعة رافضة للتدخل الأمريكي في أمريكا اللاتينية ومنطقة الكاريبي والشرق الأوسط وآسيا، كما تضم منظمات أخرى تعنى بالحقوق المدنية التواقة للعدالة الاجتماعية والاقتصادية. أطلق تحالف أنسر أولى تظاهراته الوطنية ضد الحرب والعنصرية في أعقاب هجمات 11 من أيلول سبتمبر في 29 من الشهر ذاته، وضمت 25 ألف متظاهر في واشنطن و15 ألفا في سان فرانسيسكو، حتى بات من أبرز المنتديات لمن قرروا رفع الصوت عاليا ضد الحرب والعنصرية ومقارعة الظلم، متشاركا باستراتيجيته التنظيمية مع المجتمعات والجاليات الأمريكية من أصول عربية ومسلمة والقطاعات التي همشت وأهملت عمدا ضمن نسيج المجتمع الأمريكي. المنسق الوطني لتحالف أنسر ومن قادة حزب الاشتراكية والتحرير براين بيكر كيف يقرأ الموقف الأمريكي المتدخل في شؤون المنطقة العربية وتورطه في النزاعات الطائفية والمذهبية وقيادته لتحالف ضد داعش في آن، وكيف يصف أهمية تدويل النضال والمقاومة فيما يتعلق بالقضية الفلسطينية، وماذا يقول عن آراء الأمريكيين اليوم تجاه الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي. Brian Baker, National Director of Answer, which is ACT Now, Stop War and End Racism Coalition, which is a US-based international anti-war organization and which is believed to be the largest ever international anti-war coalition. Welcome to the Inside,
Thank
sir.
you very much. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome, sir. Well, actually, Brian, in 2011, you've written an article titled US Promotes Civil War in Syria as Pretext for Intervention. Today, Obama asks for authorization from the Congress to use force in the Middle East and to train so-called moderates to topple the Syrian government and, other steps in this sense. How do you read all this?
Well, it's one of those great ironies in history. The United States government, as a matter of policy, as a matter of military strategy, and using its intelligence agencies, funneled arms and funds to armed organizations inside of Syria, creating the loss, in some cases, of territory by the Syrian government and the capturing of those territories by those armed groups. Mm-hmm. Those groups have then morphed into in a dominant way, the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. The Islamic State then...
The so-called Islamic State.
So-called Islamic State, thank you. The so-called Islamic State. And then the United States government, having created the space that allowed the Islamic State, so-called, to grow, has now used it as the pretext, the public rationale for an open-ended military campaign in Syria, which says that they're targeting Islamic State, but at the same time they refuse to partner with the main army that's been challenging the so-called Islamic State, and that would be the Syrian army. So we see here a twisted series of rationales, and it belies the fact that ultimately, the U.S. goal is to take over Syria. Ultimately, the U.S. goal is to carry out so-called regime change, the illegal overthrow of a sovereign government, and to place in power in Syria a proxy government. or minus that, to so weaken Syria by the virtue of civil war that Syria is no longer a challenge, a force, a point or axis of resistance to U.S. hegemony in this resource-rich and geostrategically important region.
But they talk about, sir, about the training of so-called moderates, and those same moderates, those very moderates are the people who abducted, the American journalists and it said, according to reports, that they sold the journalists to the ISIS, which then they liquidated. So is it reasonable to train those kind of people?
Well, the moderate opposition is a fantasy, first of all. It doesn't really exist. There may have been moderate forces who opposed the Assad government, those who were opposed to foreign military intervention, but they were swept aside by U.S. policy. And instead, the armed groups, which have become dominated by Al-Qaeda or the so-called Islamic State, they're the real military force, and everybody knows that. But the United States needs to brand its continued shipment of arms and the raising of a mercenary army in Syria in some sort of legitimate way. So what do they call it? They say the moderate opposition. How do they know that they're, quote, moderate? How do they vet them? How is that possibly what the real scenario is here? More than that, the United States does not have the right to organize a mercenary army. They can't go to refugee camps and take impoverished people and give them money and guns and say, go and fight their government. That's not legal. That's a violation of international law. That's a violation of the United Nations Charter.
Besides, which is going to backfire in the Western societies, actually, too.
Well, it creates a cycle of violence. The U.S. opportunistically arms groups like Islamic State, or as they did in Afghanistan, arming the Osama bin Laden and those who were fighting against the independent government in Afghanistan starting in 1978. But these groups have their own agenda. They're glad to take arms and money from the United States. They're willing to partner with them, but they have their own agendas. The United States can't control that. This is short-sighted, it's criminal, it's
myopic.
illegal.
Now, recently, General Wesley Clark divulged a fact, quote, ISIS got started through funding from our friends and allies to fight to death against Hezbollah, and that it has become a Frankenstein monster. This is what, and we all know who is General Wesley Clark and the type of secrets that he usually divulges. So maybe rather than continue to expand the U.S. military presence and spending billions of U.S. dollars trying to fight ISIS, why don't they talk to their allies and friends and try to find a way to cut the funding to stop this monster?
Right. Well, Wesley Clark was making the point that this was the unintended consequence of U.S. policy, or the policies of U.S. allies, meaning Saudi Arabia, meaning Qatar, meaning Turkey. They obviously gave funds either through private sources or through
even Israel,
quasi-government sources, or perhaps the Israeli state. In other words, they created the ability of the Islamic State, so-called, to become a military force. Now, is it possible to wheel that back? Is it possible just to cut funds now from Saudi Arabia or Turkey and have the Islamic State, so-called, go away? I don't think so. I think it actually exists now. It has a very big piece of territory. It's taken big parts of the oil supplies. It does live, as Clark said, like a Frankenstein. In other words, a monster that was human, was created by others, but has developed its own life. So now the United States is somewhat challenged by the Islamic State in the sense that if the Islamic State challenges what the United States considers to be its strategic assets, Baghdad, the northern part of Iraq, or Jordan, they don't want the Islamic State to expand. But if it was to be able to be contained, which I think is the real strategy of the United States.
Also, this is part of the scenario that, General Wesley Clark divulged back in 2007 with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, where he revealed that one of the top generals in the Pentagon had showed him a memo from then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld not long after the 9/11 attack, outlining U.S. global war plans. And according to Clark, at that time, the general said, we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran.
in those who drafted the project for a new American century, those who became the chief staff members of the Bush-Cheney-Rumsfeld administration, they had been identifying these countries for regime change starting in the late 1990s. Clearly, Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th. The Saddam government had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. There was a pretext being used by those who had an agenda to carry out regime change. They said it was to bring democracy to the Middle East. Obviously, that was not their real intention. It was either to take over important strategic countries in the Middle East, to weaken resistance in the Middle East, or to destroy the Middle East. In other words, to bring the Middle East to its knees here in a region that has 2/3 of the world's known oil supplies.
What are you as Answer doing in order to make the people know more, to be aware of this very big scheme that is hitting hard the Middle East?
There's great skepticism in America about U.S. foreign policy. It's very interesting that President Obama said to the American people when he went on national TV announcing open-ended war in Iraq and Syria just a few months ago, he said there will be no boots on the ground. Why not? Why, if it's an existential threat, why not send an army? Because the American people...
But the boots are already on the ground.
Well, there are boots on the ground. There are several thousand, and it's the first
under disguise.
It's the first contingent, as happened in Vietnam. First advisors, then more advisors, then more combat troops, and finally large numbers of troops. But my point is that President Obama had to promise the American people that there wouldn't be a large-scale war, because the American people won't support that.
Of course.
He's really promising, look, all the bleeding will be done by Syrians, all the bleeding will be done by Iraqis, all the bleeding will be done by Arabs. We won't bleed. So go ahead and give it support. So we in the Answer Coalition, to go back, are trying to tell the American people this is not no boots on the ground. This is the beginning of a large-scale war that will inevitably drag the United States back into a major confrontation in the Middle East.
Right. Brian, allow us to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to talk about the issue of Palestine at the International Criminal Court, but after the break. Right. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا. بعد صدور قرار من النيابة العامة في محكمة الجنايات الدولية في يناير كانون الثاني بفتح تحقيق في جرائم حرب محتملة في المناطق الفلسطينية، يدخل الصراع مرحلة متقلبة جديدة. القادة الإسرائيليون هاجموا القرار الذي اتخذه المدعون العامون في محكمة الجنايات الدولية بفتح تحقيق، ورئيس الوزراء بنيامين نتنياهو تعهد بأن الجنود الإسرائيليين لن تحاكمهم أبدا محكمة الجنايات الدولية. كذلك بدأت إسرائيل باتخاذ إجراءات انتقامية، حيث حجبت نقل الرسوم الجمركية الشهرية التي تجمعها لواردات الفلسطينيين وتقارب 125 مليون دولار، والتي تستخدمها السلطة الفلسطينية لدفع الرواتب. يقال إن نتنياهو قد التقى أخيرا مسؤولين أمنيين وخبراء في القانون الدولي لمعرفة الطرق التي تمكنه من اتخاذ الترتيبات لرفض التصديق على قرارات محكمة الجنايات الدولية. المنسق الوطني لتحالف أنسر براين بيكر، كيف يقرأ موقف إسرائيل؟ ولماذا يهدد قرار محكمة الجنايات الدولية إسرائيل لهذه الدرجة؟ ولماذا كل هذه الجلبة من قبل مجموعة نتنياهو؟
We've had an opportunity through this episode or series of incidents to sort of see how the Israeli government really thinks. The Israeli government has said for a long time there's no partner for peace with the Palestinians, that there has to be acceptance of Israel as a state, that the armed struggle of Palestinian resistance is the problem. But then when the Palestinian forces exercise a struggle through the United Nations, clearly not an armed struggle, clearly using legal channels and international law, the Israeli government uses collective punishment against the entire Palestinian people as if they've been militarily attacked, which means they treat it as if it's a very severe problem, and indeed it is. One is because the Israeli soldiers and those who ordered them into battle have committed war crimes. They have committed crimes against peace. They are culpable. They could be held accountable in front of the International Criminal Court. Even if Israel refuses to sign the treaty, bringing it into the court, which it won't sign, it still has the effect of delegitimizing and exposing the Israeli state not just globally where it's largely exposed, but also within American public opinion, which the Israelis have for a long time counted on the acquiescence or quiet in the American public opinion. I think this will create a sea change within American public opinion. And at the end of the day, the Israeli government, in spite of all of its military, it still gets $4 billion every year from the United States. And so I think that's a strategic relationship that could start to fray under this pressure.
How important is it, Brian, to internationalize the struggle? I mean, to move also to the International Court in The Hague away from the United States?
Very important, because there can be no justice through United States courts or U.S. government policy, because the United States has, since 1967, treated the Israeli government as an extension of American power. And it's not simply the strength of the Jewish lobby. The American government has identified the Israeli military establishment as an extension of Pentagon power in this region since 1967. So it has to be internationalized, because there is the possibility of growing global pressure that will blow back into the United States too. In other words, the United States is not exempt from that pressure, but it has to come through international pressure. Similarly to what happened in South Africa. The boycott of South Africa, the delegitimization of the South African racist apartheid regime in the mid-1980s finally became the decisive element that broke the U.S. policy in terms of South Africa. I think that's how we must understand the way justice can be won in the struggle with Israel.
Right. Well, actually, a recent CNN poll shows that the interesting information that 66% of Americans and 75% of them below the age of 50 believe that the United States should be neutral between Israel and Palestine, but we tend always to see that there is a unanimous or near unanimous support of the 535 members of the Congress to everything that Israel, which is a foreign country to them, does or wants or needs or whatever.
It's this dichotomy between the changed views of the American people and the unanimous consensus within Congress. That's a dichotomy that will only grow and grow and grow. And that's very important. There is a sea change in America. And like all changes, they happen sometimes subterranean, sometimes under the surface, but then finally they break out and you see we're in a different political reality. In 2002, when Israel reinvaded the West Bank, we had a demonstration of 100,000 people for Palestine in Washington. Nothing like that had ever happened before. In 2006, with the bombing of Lebanon, the 2008 bombing of Gaza, 2012, and the recent invasion against Gaza in August, we see the American people coming out more and more, identifying that the government that speaks in their name is spending their tax dollars for a cause that they no longer believe in. That's going to be fundamentally important.
This is
in American
awareness.
politics.
Yeah, very important, right? Now, the British Guardian newspaper has reported that around 700 artists joined cultural boycott of Israel in reaction to what they termed the Palestinian catastrophe. When are we going to see such a thing in the U.S.?
Well, there's
among the artists. In Hollywood, for example.
I think the artists, especially in the last couple decades, are very slow to follow popular trends, especially when it comes to buck the culture industry, to buck Hollywood, and to buck Wall Street. So I think it's slower in the United States. There's more lassitude. The artists are more privileged, less connected to the people. But again, this is our job. It's the job of the American people to create such a hornet's nest of opposition that any performing artist can't possibly not listen to the people.
Have you been working on this, Brian?
Yes, because this is ultimately when the grassroots become strong enough to impact the artists, to impact the performers, to impact celebrities, they in turn become a catalyst for a rapid dynamic shift in public opinion.
Right. Now, in Stop Giving Palestinians a Pass, which was in the New York Times on January 4th this year, Dennis Ross, former U.S. Middle East chief negotiator, blames the Palestinians for the lack of peace with Israel. And he cites I'm quoting him, 3 serious negotiations, the 2000 Clinton parameters, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's 2008 proposal, and the recently ended negotiations led by Secretary of State John Kerry. And Ross implies that Palestinian refusal to compromise spoiled each of these opportunities. How do you read such remarks?
Well, Dennis Ross is an echo chamber for Israeli propaganda. I mean, he should just work for the Israeli state and not the American state. But let's look at the actual record. When President Obama came into office, he gave a speech in June 9th in Cairo, June 9th, 2009, where he was trying to build new bridges to the Arab and Muslim world. After that time, he said the Israeli settlements in the West Bank must be ended. They can be not ended, but no more construction. What did the Israeli government do? They went to war against the Obama administration, carrying out an open political campaign. Dennis Ross doesn't really speak for Obama right now when he says that. That's, again, the echo chamber of Israeli propaganda. It's been clear that the Israeli government has been the provocateurs here. They not only have, in the face of the Obama administration's demand that they stop the illegal settlements in West Bank, they've built more and more and more into East Jerusalem, carrying out all kinds of provocations against Palestinian life and Palestinian religious institutions. So we see and know that it has been the Israelis who have gone out of their way to avoid any possibility of peace. That peace, in fact, is a great threat, maybe the greatest threat to the Israeli establishment, because it breaks their rationale for continued aggression. And I don't believe that anybody really, except for the Israeli propaganda machine inside the United States, including with Dennis Ross, actually believes that anymore. Ultimately, that dream explodes. And the explosion this time will not be in the form of a bomb or some military equipment. The explosion will be the explosion of world public opinion that will isolate the Israeli government. The United States didn't always see Israel as an extension of American power. That happened in June 1967, during the 1967 war, when the U.S. was bogged down in Southeast Asia and the Arab nationalist revolution was taking place. At a certain point, the United States may very well now believe, or start to believe, that Israel is not a strategic asset, but a strategic liability in this region. If that were to happen, all of the Israeli expansionist policies, its racism, its apartheid policies, will explode even within America in terms of backfiring in terms of public opinion.
Maybe that's why the Americans are trying to not update the Israelis with if any progress is taking place with the nuclear dossier with Iran. They're trying to hide this and saying that, well, we'll speak about everything when we reach something.
Yes, I think that the United States realizes that Netanyahu is actively trying to sabotage the U.S. foreign policy with a major power in the Middle East, in this case Iran. The United States engages and tries to engage in negotiations on Iran's nuclear program, and the Israeli government, really getting $4 billion a year from the United States, turns around and tries to sabotage, leak information about the negotiations, and bring it down. And Netanyahu's invitation to come to Washington by the Republicans was designed first and foremost not only to humiliate Obama, but to try to sabotage the Iran nuclear arms negotiations.
Now, one last question, if I may. Well, there are direct negative effects of conflicts on global human security, refugees, and forced migrations. There are at least 263,000 IDPs, which is internally displaced Palestinians, in occupied Palestine as of the 3rd of October 2014. And also in Lebanon, we have millions of refugees, Syrian refugees and Palestinian hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. In Iraq, we have internally displaced Iraqis, and also we have Syrian refugees. What is the negative effect of these protracted and ongoing forced migrations?
What we see happening as a consequence, a direct consequence of U.S. policies, the invasion of Iraq, 5 million Iraqi refugees, 3 million out of the country, 2 million internally. We see huge refugee flows from Syria. The other countries can't sustain that. The burden is so great.
There's a kind of demographic change.
There's a demographic change, and what I believe we're witnessing really is the destabilization of a region which was sort of ready, set to go in terms of economic development. It can't develop under these kind of pressures. And so you have a situation where a region of the country that has this vast and important resource, natural resource, petroleum and oil, if it were able to develop really and be able to control those resources, they would become a major power. Civil war, occupation, invasion, refugee flows, that makes that impossible.
Right, Mr. Brian Baker, National Director of Answer. Many thanks indeed for joining us. You're most welcome, sir. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد بقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinside@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل. من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.